And as a result of just constantly telling these youth, we got you. We got you. Like, it doesn't matter who else is against you, we got you, right? There was a young man who was walking through Stellarton, his name is Bradley, and I know he won't mind me saying his name. He was walking home one evening, and he saw the "It's okay to be white" signs posted all through Stellarton, and he saw a gentleman who was posting them up. And he looked at it, and first he walked by, and then he said, I remembered something that I saw you say on Facebook, that we do have options. So he went back and he ripped every one of them down. And then, of course, he contacted me, and I told him, listen, because the other part is empowering others, right? And empowering these youth. Like, this is what you do. And he ended up having an interview with the media and such. But the effect of that was, then a young girl, an African Nova Scotian female who goes to that school, was an exam week that week, and they were posted all outside of the school. And she said, thank you for doing that, because if I had came in to write my exam and that's the first thing I saw, I don't know how I would have reacted to that. It wouldn't have been a good situation. So I think when we don't know what to do, just acting is enough. Just because somebody will know what to do. And I've said to Raymond when we started to connect with this, because he was up here saying, I got to do something too, right? And we've been kind of together ever since.
So Angie, here's a question. Yeah. And then we're going to hear from some of the audience. Is what struck me is you said you encountered this a month after it happened. Mm-hmm. Do you think that when you mentioned a youth, do you think that many years ago, we don't have to say how many, that a month would have passed without any action on that? Or do you think this is a phenomenon of now? What would have happened different? Do you think would have been any different?
I think the reason why it was a month that passed is because it was hidden for a month. Like, it took them a week to charge him. And it didn't go public until the mother actually made it public, because they were doing nothing. So that's why it took a month. Yeah, so she went to the media because they were playing it off like he just needed a Band-Aid. And they were laughing in media articles and stuff, and so she contacted the media because she wanted it to be dealt with appropriately, right? I mean, he had a punctured lung, and he's now got 3% loss functioning and such or whatever. So
here's one more question before others can chime in. Is what organizations, like official organizations,
right,
are on board helping to further this issue? I mean, you mentioned the group that you have mobilized. I know, Raymond, I've seen, you've been a part of the mobilization. I saw the demonstration that you guys had there. So what organizations have come on board? Like, I'm thinking organizations that in the past we would have, like BUF and...
I think that's the challenge.
So I just put that out there. What are the organizations that have said, well, what organizations can or did or will the organizers go to say, we need your support? Who is that? Who is that? Maybe someone else can jump in on this. Any thoughts on what Angie has said, or Raymond, or the questions that have been posed?
Well, as far as organizations go, there's none. Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Shelley Fashion. I've been a part of activism since I was around 15. So that's at least 50-some years.
No.
I am Donna King, as you can see from the hairstyle.
Be careful, you're talking about 65, right?
Yeah, that's right. But there were organizations in the past that addressed political activism for the Black community. And I remember the Ujamaa Association with Rocky, who was leading it, had just started to, create, to build its alliances with the community. There were a couple of really good decisions that came out of that. There was a restorative inquiry for the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children. That was something that Ujamaa
Hill and Pecan.
Canadian caucus.
After the Canadian caucus, we were primarily involved in justice issues. When the United States was involved in justice issues, about law. Organizations, you say, or organizations would just appear and be a part of what needed to happen to challenge particular issues. So I put that out there before we go to the next person. Do we want to have a comment from anybody there before we go on to the next person about some of these ideas that are stewing right now? Who's up?
Well, I was going to say that, and I know that, oh, would you have a hand? Oh, yes.
Microphone.
Can you pass the mic back? Thank you.
Okay.
Just on this topic, very briefly, I guess I just wanted to say that you can't build a coalition with an individual. So the solidarity work that might be possible is extremely difficult when there are no political organizations with which to build organizational or particular unity around any particular struggle.
Okay. Introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Ifo Kede. I am Isoko from the Niger Delta, West Africa. The British visited us about a few hundred years ago, and I say visit very sarcastically. And one of the things that colonialists always do is divide and conquer. And malaria was killing them off, and so they decided they were going to figure out ways to bribe and to kill leadership if they needed to, and then replace the leadership with whatever leadership that they thought would be more suitable to their needs. My understanding in Nova Scotia, they didn't necessarily kill off leadership, but they might have cut funds for groups that were doing things right. They might have given jobs to certain individuals, and then after people got the job, they were then informed that there were restrictions on what they could not do or say in that job position. So I think that we've been under attack collectively as African people for over 400 years. And I think that there's not necessarily been enough understanding of how much we have been attacked. And Malcolm X said that if you're not careful, the media will have you basically blaming the victims of oppression for their own oppression. And I think that systematically, like people keep asking questions about what's wrong with the black community, or collectively they'll say what's wrong with Africa, or they'll ask you what's wrong with Haiti, or they'll ask you what's wrong with Venezuela. But in the end, this is white supremacy, this is white power that figures out ways to destroy a community. The audacity of the Canadian government to decide that they didn't like the person who won the election in Venezuela, and so they're going to put somebody else who has declared himself to be president. We see similar things that have happened here in Nova Scotia. We see similar things that happen within the African diaspora community. The greater white power structures decide who they think is leadership, which is usually whoever they think is most corrupt, and then they work with those people. And then they cut off funding, and they don't care who dies. Look at Venezuela right now. They've cut off money from the government, and then given it to criminals to decided to be president.
You don't have to look that far away, do we?
No, but this is happening right now. You know what I mean? So I think that this system to continue.
I'll be issues also.
Yeah. So I think in spite of all the attacks that we've had over 400 years, we're still here. And whether they like it or not, we ain't going nowhere. But I think collectively we need to bring the fire back. We need to bring the spirit of unity back. And we need to understand that we don't all have to get along to organize. White power don't get along. They have different interests, but they still organize around the idea of we need to basically do something to maintain our power. So I think we need black people to start talking more about black power. And that's part of our history of how we got forward. And then we lost that touch because we're doing this integration thing. And as our elders said, I'm afraid we're trying to integrate in 29 hours.
That's great. So, yeah, before that was good. I know that we're going to hear some response to that as we go on. We're probably going to move over to this side of the room right now. And just to pick up on the point there, one of my great, inspirators, leaders, late Dr. Rocky Jones, said at a lecture that I went to very early on in my knowing him. And he talked about be mindful that what's happening as time was marching on was that he referred to as the welfareization of the black community. Is that what was beginning to happen is that organizations that traditionally would advocate on behalf of the community were all becoming funded. And everybody got on the government payroll. And so all of our organizations ceased their own welfare. And so they could not speak out anymore. And that has stunted, in his view, and I concur, because he really did his analysis. And I was just coming into the knowledge of the community at that time. I was quite young. And of course, over the period of time that I knew him, it worsened. And I think at probably maybe it's worse state right now. And Brother Ifo has pointed that out. I just wanted to just underline what he said. And one of our great leaders flagged that long before it got to the stage that it is. So we're going to go to Sister.
Yeah, and I remember when Tina was early in Nova Scotia and trying to examine some of the different organizations, just to get an understanding of what were the roles of the different organizations. So I don't know if that's where you want to pick up the conversation, Tina, or I'll leave it to you, and how you want to lead your conversation.
I have a lot of different thoughts about activism. Talking about some of the work that I was doing before, a lot of it was about accountability and about our accountability to ourselves, because the government and other people outside of ourselves, to me, they weren't really the concern. Like whether, I guess part of what I felt was that in order for us to move forward as a community, that we have to trust each other, that we have to be able to work with each other, that we have to have methods and ways of communicating amongst ourselves and dealing with certain things that are just true. Like there aren't imperfect leaders. There isn't going to be some one organization or some one group of people who are going to be able to solve or to address all of the issues. It's going to take each of us feeling like we have a voice. And I guess I think like what was being said before, I think voice is very important. And being able to make space so that everyone feels like they have something to contribute. I mean, my own brand of activism is just to do what I can. What can I do? Like that, and that's not necessarily, that doesn't address some of the wider issues, because I do understand, like, activism is in part about working together. And I guess that's why I think that, I certainly have room to grow in, and I think that there is space for broader conversations about that, because some of it is about making sure that we have the capacity all along the way, so that when something happens, we already have those relationships. We've already done the work of knowing each other, of holding each other accountable, of consistently showing up for each other, so that when we need to come out en masse, because like I end up doing lots of thinking. I feel like there are lots of structural things that are systemically built to limit the capacity of people to rise up. So if there is disproportionate income, disproportionate, relations to the criminal justice system, if there are all of these structural things, lack of access to health care, lack of access to all of these things, that makes it really hard for an individual to do something. because like if we're only dependent upon individuals, then when that individual, you know, has something happen in their life, they get sick, they lose their job, they have some other struggle, then that means that all of that work is now put on hold. And so a lot of what I think is about what we can do to work together to sort of build that capacity. And there are people who are doing that right now. The question of is activism dead? To me, you know, of course it's not dead. There are people working all the time, everywhere, even if we don't necessarily see them. There are people who, in all parts of this problem, there's never been a time that people in our communities haven't been working, active, and addressing issues. And when people had even far more resources than we have right now, people have always been active. And so I think that, you know, I think that it's sort of like meant to sort of demoralize us to think that we should be further, or people haven't been doing enough, people haven't been active. Because I think that people have, and that the system is built in a way that purposely tries to constrict our ability to do even more, to communicate, to have flourishing businesses and, you know, news sources. Collins and I were talking about an idea we have for a black newspaper, a way of communicating similar to what we had in the past, to revive that for the present. I guess I'll leave it there.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Pass it on.
Yes. Thank you. Just write it, interject, Will.
Yeah, like a lot of stuff kind of been going through my brain the last however long I've been here, even since I got the phone call to kind of take part in this. The call kind of came from someone I really respect, and I almost couldn't say no to the person, not even knowing really what I was getting involved in. And I mean, in sitting here right now, like, you know, when I thought of activism, when the phone call came in, like, I probably wouldn't consider myself to be an activist for whatever reason, but like just, I never really see myself as someone like that. But in sitting here and kind of listening to the stories and just hearing kind of what is, and even thinking about like what is activism, I guess it is, yeah, like just taking action. And over the years, I've grown to see myself as a leader, especially in my community, and then abroad. And so to take that leadership role and kind of just take it as a responsibility is kind of me being active. I hear a lot of the things, and I just think like, well, first, like, and foremost is like, yeah, activism necessarily isn't dead because there's people that are doing things, and it doesn't always look traditional. Like you said, like, you know, it could be something as simple as just conversations or talking to somebody, anybody, about like things that are happening. And, you know, being a black man from North Preston, who come from a criminal past, and, you know, you always see the attack that comes, and you kind of like, one of the biggest things for me was always like, well, people like look down on us, essentially, right? Sometimes because of our own doings, but just in general, we just kind of get that perception painted. And, you know, the system kind of created, not to say they created our way of living, but like they kind of put us in the predicament. And so now as we grow, we see things differently, and we kind of get into a different perspective. It's like, well, when we want to rise up and when we want to kind of take charge, take action, and do different things, like a lot of times we don't really see the support, not just like for one community, but when I was growing up, my family kind of always kept me a part of like the Black Nova Scotia community abroad. And that's something that I usually try to like push, to kind of bring people in and bring people together, because it's difficult when you see stuff like that happen in like, you know, in other places where it's like, well, how come we aren't a part of that? And vice versa, you know what I mean? And so, I mean, I guess, like I said, I don't really think of things in the form of activism in that word, because in my brain I kind of had like a different view of what it really was. But in listening to people talk, it's just taking action and just being something, you know what I mean? Like being something for people to kind of have hope and move forward. I got a whole bunch of thoughts, but my brain just kind of...
Well, if you're comfortable, can you tell us a situation that you've dealt with, that you've been involved with in your community?
I mean, there's a lot of situations. I mean, like when, for example, right now, there's a lot of issues going on with the school.
Right.
You know what I mean? And being a parent, my son is in Nelson Winder School, and just kind of seeing some of the gaps that's happening is like, yo, like we can't just sit back and just allow these things to happen. So, I mean, we just kind of join together as parents, and just a few of us come to the table, like, what can we do? And we reach out to different people, like, what can we do to kind of, you know, assist what's happening, to kind of change it. And one of the struggles that I guess that I've seen in these recent months is that, like, there isn't those, like, strong organizations that you can kind of lean to. There's a couple people, right, that can kind of, but there isn't those strong organizations. And especially growing up, like, having those family connections that always kind of put stuff in my ear, and having leaders from the community and my family, and seeing kind of how they went about things. Like, you just don't really have the connection to a lot of those pillar organizations to be like, yo, this is something that's happening right now in our lives, and we need help. So when you kind of try to get active or activate, you don't really know where to go, and you just do whatever. And so I think, like, there's a whole bunch of me's essentially out there, like, not just in my community, but like in the Black community abroad, that are seeing issues and they're starting to attack them, don't really know how to attack them, but they're moving. And there's this big gap, there's this bridge between, like, myself and, like, maybe this group, like, of people. Like, you know, I've heard of Raymond a long time ago, but I'd never actually met him. But there's this big gap between people like myself and people like you. And I guess this is basically the beginning of closing those gaps, right? But I think in order to bring activism to a real, alive state, if it's not dead, is to kind of open up the opportunity or the doors to let people know, like, basically, like, yo, we are here to support you, and what do you think, and what do you see kind of taking place for us to move forward? Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
If I may. Several points. Thank you, brother, for the notarization there. But we all have a starting point where something calls on us, something happens in us that moves us, and so on. You may not be today where you think I am, but keep on keeping on, and you will be there. And when the circumstance, event moves you, you can do wonderful things, and so on. You spoke about strong organizations. Well, strong organizations take strong people. That's why they become strong organizations. Strong together. That's very important. I'll give you an example. October 9th, I guess it was, an ally in Dartmouth who used to teach at St. Mary's University contacted me and said, did you hear about whatever? Young man being shot in the back, whatever. And I was like horrified. That same day, I picked up a paper and seen a picture and so on. And I was like hitting the ceiling. And I said, let me see, I'm from New Glasgow basically, and I know whatever, but I don't have phone numbers and so on. She said, oh, I got Doreen Paris's number. I said, oh, give me Doreen's. Doreen said, we're gonna have a meeting tomorrow, can you come? I jumped in my car and went to New Glasgow, and so on. And I've been involved ever since. And, you know, that's it. It's not so much, and I'll speak about organizations in a moment, because after 50 years, I know a lot of organizations that existed that no longer exist and whatever, for many reasons. And back to Brother Ifo, who said about governments setting up the leadership of our organizations and appointing leaders and so on and so on, and that is commonplace here. But if you're the weakest link, oh, we'll put you whatever, and you know, and then you saw as whether you are or not, a cell load and blah blah blah, and it takes on a whole another meaning. But you know, it's important in communities to know who can or who is willing to. It's as simple as that. Doreen knew that I was willing to, I had the experience and I was willing to come down to New Glasgow and lay my life on the line if I had to. I have a track record. Not to brag, that's the way it is. I'm committed to the struggle on all levels, on all levels. And she knew I had an understanding, and then I met my cousin here, knew her mother for 50 years, and so on. I met my cousin here, and we headed off, and so on, and we've been working together back and forth and so on ever since. Okay, I'll talk, I'm sure then. And so on. So organizations are important. Like, for instance, we had to contact the I had to contact the AUPA to have them issue a press release and so on. African Canadian, what is it, African Affairs or whatever it's called, Nova Scotian Affairs, they don't speak out on anything, it seems. And, you know, so me personally, I don't depend on organizations. I used to work for the Black United Front. There wasn't, until whatever, but there was an organization that one could depend on. Let me give you an example. When I was back, before I started working for Buff, I was back in high school in Guysborough, and when teachers got, well, when they were acting normal, I guess. Anyway, we would say, I'm taking you to the Black United Front. They were scared like, oh, what? And so on. They were scared shitless, excuse the expression, and so on. But with these other organizations, it's like, you can name off 5 or 6 and so on, and it's like, oh yeah, whatever.
Yeah, I just had coffee with them last night.
Whatever. If you mentioned Buff back in the day, you know, with so many people, Buff was a good training ground for all of us who worked with Buff. It was a really, really good training ground for us. And it's too bad that it no longer exists, because Buff was a good organization, in my opinion. And I would debate anybody who said otherwise, but at the same time, it's my opinion. And I think, you know, it is important in a community, like for instance, in your community. My life partner is from North Preston, and we've been together for 26, 27 years. And so on. And I do advocacy work in North Preston. People come to me and say, oh, I got turned down for Canada Pension Disability, and then I will act on it. I used to work with WCB, so, oh, gee, can you help me with this? Can you help me with that, or whatever? And then I go to court with people. You know, and so many other things. I refer them sometimes to lawyers that I know over the years, and so on, those kinds of things. But it's, as I said before, and I'll close because there's so many other people that need to speak or should speak, you know who can or who might be willing to is very, very important.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Just to sort of pick up on some of the points that came out, Tina, I really like what you said about it's about us holding each other accountable. So I just throw that back out there, holding each other accountable, not just, I mean, because one of the things that helped spur this event was in a private conversation with someone who talked about the fact that most of the, since we're talking about organizations, so bring these two pieces together, is that the question was, who are organizations that are set up to serve Black people, who are they accountable to? Are they accountable to the Black community? Or are they accountable to a government ministry? Are they accountable to some advisory board here or there? And the person said, you know, back in the day, you could at least, you could go walk into the office and say to somebody this or that. Nowadays, you know, with government offices, first of all, everybody, you could get buzzed in. You can't walk in.
Yeah.
You know, the whole place is on lockdown. You know, and you have to wait so long to even see anybody or to get any action done. So, like, the whole structure of taking ourselves inside of the belly of the whale has made it such that if you were at odds even with a black organization or a service entity, you can't even, they could avoid you indefinitely, really, they could. By the way in which where they are, et cetera. They didn't like what you had to say. They're just, the security guards are there, and just whereas years ago they would just say, "Come in here and sit down. Let's talk this out." So there are so many different ways, and I've seen that happen because I worked inside a government office building where people have come down to African Services Division or down to the Council on African Education, and they'd be, incensed and angry, and come bring them upstairs and sit them down. But there are some people that said who have called security on people. Because I don't want to deal with you today, I'm enough. And I didn't take too kindly watching that happen, but I have witnessed it. So these are the kinds of things that I just throw back out, holding each other accountable. The other thing that has come out is, have our organizations gone from being activist organizations to service organizations? They're delivering a service. Providing a service, as opposed to a mindset or a service without a philosophy. I mean, what is the grounded philosophy in these organizations? Because most of the time it seems these days that the overarching mentality and philosophy behind fixing the problems of African Nova Scotians is, if we could just get a bit more money, if we could just get a bit more staff, if we could just get, more direct line access in terms of how we report through to particular government ministries or particular organizations. So they're all technical fixes, right? So everything, if you just get the right combination and tinker with the, with the equation, then we would have this nice little rounded entity or infrastructure that could solve our problems. But no one really talks about what is the underlying philosophy that addresses the real reasons why there's this kind of marginalization. It's not really always resources, because we know we have some organizations that are highly resourced and highly effective. And we have organizations that are under-resourced and doing great things, right? Because it's not a technical issue. It's a political issue. And we know that sometimes in our government, we will have them say, "Oh, we can't fix that because we don't have the right technical resources to fix it." Then you have other times where it's not about fixing it money. It's about the will to say, we're changing that. We're changing that. We're not doing it this way anymore, right? Because it's about the will and politics, the philosophy, the worldview, the psychology. Throw that out. So let's hear from someone.
Yeah,
Oh, here.
I want to hear. Oh, there's a hand over there as well. And
Sebastian?
Hi, my name is Sebastian. When I heard you talking, Delvina, and EFO as well, it made me think, we touched a little bit upon how, having social media now has changed or impacted how we organize. But when you talked about welfare dependence of organization, it made me think of something that there seems to be a growing awareness, or I don't know if it's something new or if I'm just personally only now becoming aware of it, but it seems there's a growing awareness of the erosion of the black economy. And Killer Mike on a show on Netflix had a show about that, about how it's really hard now to find black-owned businesses to support a black economy. Whereas in the 60s, there was a very strong black economy for bad reasons. Because of segregation, black communities were forced into developing their own self-sustaining economies. And I'm not from Nova Scotia originally, so I'm not sure how well that translates locally. But there's a sense that in a time where there was a more vibrant black economy, there were resources available within the community that could support organizing outside of government structures. Whereas with a seeming decline in a black economy, the resources available to black organizing are from government structures that have political strings attached to them. And so there's not an independent locally sourced resources within a black economy that's available to kind of resource organizers and organizations. And so I wonder what the relationship is between resources available for organizing politically independent from government structures and a decline in black businesses.
Okay. Excellent question. Anybody want to jump on that one?
Kind of similar.
Okay, we'll take
but it's
that
going to
too.
change the conversation slightly.
I don't want to leave that one hanging, though.
Because that's a good point, and he's talking economics, and that's really my bailiwick. I love that topic, and Colin and I know all about that. But here's the thing. Here's what I'm thinking is that, we talk a lot about African Nova Scotians, for example, and I'm trying to define what that is and who's included in that. Is it a shared history, for example, that defines a person as being an African Nova Scotian, or is it simply defined by the color of our skin? And I ask that question because, I've always felt that if we're going to focus on, for example, let's talk reparations. So let's talk, how our past has impacted our current and our future, right? So I'll use a simple example that everybody knows, Africa. I've always asked the question of myself, what would have happened if that atrocity never happened? If those homeowners had maintained their property, which now would have been worth a fortune, right? The history of Africville impacted the current generations of those descendants from Africville in a direct, factual way, right? They could have become business owners. They could have mortgaged their houses and bought a small business. But they became renters in Uniacke Square and Mulgrave Park, so they became generations of people who didn't know the value of home ownership, for example, right? So my thought is that if we're looking at for example, making the government responsible for, at least in part, for where we're at today, we've got to go back in time. The model has already existed. The indigenous population, for example, uses their own heritage in order to justify the current situation and the rights that they continue to fight for, and they do a good job of advocacy. They still have a ways to go as well. The struggle continues, but they base it on lineage, right? They base it on, my grandfather was here. My grandfather suffered atrocities. So therefore, there's a relevance to where I'm at today, right? And I don't know that we do that so much. I think it's great that we all share the current. When you're black, it doesn't matter if you're from Nova Scotia or you're from the U.S. or you're going to experience racism today. That's a fact as well. But what is a different fact is that those people who've been here for 150 years or more have the generational atrocities, generational oppression impacts the lives of our kids today. And that's undeniable. So if we're looking at advocacy, I think part of the issue is how do we define the group that we're advocating for? Are we advocating for, for example, in this case, people with a shared history of atrocities? Are we advocating for anybody that shows up who happens to be black, right? Because there's a difference there, and there's a different strategy involved, and there's a different potential outcome, right? Now, the other point that I won't take much time on is around the business side, and inspiring our young people to take on ownership of small businesses, to buy houses, to make investments, and so on. We need to advocate. We need work within our own community to have a better understanding of how to succeed financially, economically, et cetera, right? We need to unlearn old behaviors, such as, renting, in public housing. In other words, we need to unlearn those behaviors. We need to learn new behaviors around, I got to save up enough money to get a mortgage, right? We cannot spend $200 for a new pair of Nike shoes. We got to invest that money in a different venue. We got to make money with the money we have. We got to leverage what we have. We also have to learn, I think, to buy from one another in the community, right? We don't do a great job, and I'll use the Lebanese community as an example. We do a much better job of supporting each other. If I'm looking for a carpenter, I should be looking for a carpenter who's black. And that black carpenter should be looking for a retailer who owns a small business when they want to buy a suit, right? And that's called the money multiplier. So you take a $5 bill, and I give you $5, and you take $4 of that, and you give that to another black person. That black person takes $3 of that and gives it to another black person. Now you've got how much when you add it all up, right? So there needs to be a strategy around that as well, and that's a different level of advocacy, right? So those are 2 points. Sorry.
Thank you. Before we go, I just want to jump in there because I don't want to leave Sebastian's point hanging, and it does tie in with what Darren is saying in terms of black economy. I'm not, I mean.
Can I, well, what I got to say also
Go ahead.
kind of fits into that because,
Okay.
first of all, let me say that I believe advocacy is alive, but it looks different.
Mm-hmm.
And what we need and how we go after what we need is different. And we talk about accountability. I don't know how other people feel, but it's not only black people that we have to hold accountable. I think we do not give our vote to anybody who doesn't have a black agenda. And if the next politician that rolls up there trying to make, you know, a play for, you know, I'm running for MLA, I'm running for even county council. What is your black agenda? The LBG, you know, you know.
Lots of alphabets.
Yeah, the alphabets people, you know, they go in and they ask. Yeah, they ask, what are you going to do for our community? Women step up and they question politicians around, what do you intend to do? But we as black people have to step up and say, you don't get our vote. You have to answer some of these questions. What are your thoughts on reparations? Why should you walk into, if we don't start speaking to politicians in that way and letting them know that they're on notice, they will continue the same status quo that they have been going by for the longest time. So when we talk about activism, it has to be on a number of levels. We will deal with racism. And that kind of activism around racism is where we need our organizations to step up for us and address that. We also need to understand that we are in the decade for people of African descent. And what is going on? I think that it has allowed government to focus in on us, but not in the way we want. You know, so we got to step up and say,
How should they focus in, and what is the way we want?
well, what I'm saying is that they have become aware of the fact that the UN has dedicated 10 years to the people of African descent, but these people have not stepped up and done anything for people of African descent. It made them aware, but what happens is they'll say, well, we'll do this, but when you talk about black organizations, the mandate isn't ours. It has to fit in with their government policies, and we got to stop allowing that to happen. We have to say, if you're going to set up an Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs, this is what we need. And this is the mandate. We'll decide that mandate because you have an obligation to us because it's our taxes that are paying your salary. And we got to start demanding the fact that we have to fight this fight on a number of different levels. We have to fight it on the political side, the economic side, and let them know that we're not going nowhere. Because what happens is they are being paid to fight. You got your liberals and you got your conservatives, and they're all getting paid. No, white people don't all agree, but at least they're getting paid not to agree. You know? And the thing is that we have to start saying, we are here. Look at Raymond's sweater. We've been here, and we're not going nowhere. And we want to let you know that you can no longer excuse us and say, you know, well, then make them happy over here, give them that little organization, and but we'll control it because they have to fall within our government policies, by the way, that we made without you being there. And so we have to start to hold government accountable, saying that doesn't work. Anybody that goes into government has to have an African agenda. You cannot be the premier of the province without some kind of African agenda. You cannot be an MLA and come here and say, I want your vote. For what? What are you going to do about the black community? What commitment have you made? What are you prepared to take to the House? This is what we see. So we're going to have to start at the political level as well as the individual level of racism, because right now we see that that's on the increase as well. So when we talk about individual cases, we as a black community will support each other. We do, unless they, and social media sometimes gets it out there. Some people are better at it than I am. I'm not real good at that social media stuff because I'm too old. But I think I got a little handle on it. But so I see things on social media, and I think that whether we like it or not, the United States and what's going on there has impacted us here in Canada. Because when I heard you saying this thing about white, what was it? No, this, oh yeah, that's around.
It's okay to be white?
It's okay to be white? Yes. Now, what does that mean?
It's okay to be racist.
Thank you. Just like make America great again. Yeah. But in what period did they want to make it? You know, like, are we talking
and
the
when was white
period?
Never great?
You know, exactly. So therefore, I think we need to take a political as well as a provincial approach to how we address activism, because we need to fight this on a number of fronts. And we always got to recognize that it is our government that we have to hold accountable, and we talk about, and it's time to start making noise about reparations and all that kind of stuff, because we've been here and we pay taxes, and you don't get our vote without an agenda. And that's how I feel around the whole thing of political. And you know, we talk about black people should buy from black people in economics and that, but it ain't gonna happen if you don't get no loan. You know, so we got to start being in control of our own resources. So, you know, like those are the kind of points that I feel around activism. It's not going nowhere. It will always be here, but how we address it nowadays might be just a little different.
Thank you. Yes, those 3 points they do dovetail. And before we let some other people in on this conversation, and I don't purport to be able to, you know, magically tie them all together. I'll say a couple things, which is like, you know, Sebastian's point about the black economy. You know, Darren's points about do we really, you know, have the mindset. And you mentioned about, you know people like just want to buy their sneakers instead of things just to invest and get ahead. And then you had a question. It was, do we? I don't see it, but that's what it was. Yeah, who are we fighting for when we do these things? That's what you were saying. Yeah, and Sherry, you tied it in the activism with also the political realm, and those things are related. But you know. I think that it's really important to note what you're saying there, that there is a huge connection and correlation between, you know, an economy that exists in the African Nova Scotian community and how that translates into activism. Because the same skills that are utilized in being self-determined and entrepreneurship are the same skills that are utilized in terms of activist work. If we were to have the time to do a study, we would be able to show in our own situation. And as you were saying that, and as Darren, you were saying what you were saying, my mind started racing with all the communities I've over the years, you know, worked in the African Nova Scotian community. And like many of those communities, the people who were leaders in those communities were the entrepreneurs. You know, the most compelling example is, you know, there was no accident that Viola Desmond stood up for herself. She was an entrepreneur. So she had the skill sets. She knew what to do. So when we say an economy, it doesn't mean necessarily that there would need to be a critical mass of, that would be great, of African Nova Scotian people who have, like, you know, a lot of wealth. It's not about wealth in terms of like the numbers and so forth, but it's also about being self-determined, that you solve your own problems, you have solutions. You could just have a business that's not necessarily, you know, rendering you this, you know, grandiose lifestyle, and that may not even necessarily need to be or should be the desire of having a business. It's about being self-sustaining, self-sufficient, cooperative economics, and being in charge of oneself. And so when I think, for instance, like, and I went down in the guys with Mr. Ainsley Clyke, you know, he was very radical and so forth, and he was an entrepreneur, you know what I mean? He had his own business. When I think of, for instance, you know, Raymond Tynes up in Truro, you know, Raymond owned his own rig, 18-wheel rig. He was an entrepreneur, because like when you run a business, you know how to do things. You know, when I think of people like Mr. Calvin Ruck, who used to have ship-shake cleaners and come around in the van and collect your uncle, that's right, come around and collect your dry cleaning and so forth. When I think of people when I was growing up, you know, who would have their own businesses. You didn't go to Sally's to buy black hair products. There was always someone peddling them in the back of their trunk, like Mr. Joe Wiggins and these kinds of people would do those things, right? And that, you know, women did hair out of their house. Right? Now what happens is black women who can do hair, they're trying their best to, you know, rent a chair in a shop somewhere in town, right? Sydney had holes, yes, this is what segregation did, yes, but Sydney and all of the research I've done in that community, you know, they had tailors and they had, you know, restaurants and they had hairdressers and they had all these, and these entrepreneurs, these same skill sets were used to advocate, you know, which is why they had Melnick Hall and why they had, you know, the UNIA Hall, United Negro Improvement Hall, and, you know, and the kind of resources. And I think of the George Washington Carver Credit Union Hall that we had out in the Prestons, right? And the kind of, you know, fostering a culture of entrepreneurship, and those contractors and people involved in construction, et cetera, those individuals, when they came out to ratepayers meetings and so forth, they had skill sets, because those skill sets transfer. Yeah. But now people are consumers of everything. And because they're not creating, you know, value, then when they show up, they don't have the skill sets to know how to advocate for themselves, to know how to, because there's the lack, not just the lack of an economy in the terms of dollars in, dollars out, but the lack of an economy in terms of the mindset and philosophy of self-sufficiency, being able to provide for oneself.
There's also been the added challenge, and going back to some of the stuff that you asked Sebastian or talked about, and I often think about historical trauma, and when Darren was talking about the fact of people not being able to own their own homes, and if Afrifield didn't happen, they would have some of that equity to be able to purchase. And I also think about education. And the fact that our trades folks didn't have to have an education to open up a business, right? And so they were able to be a carpenter, be a plumber, be an electrician, self-taught at a very early age, and have their own business and own their own business. And were being hired by big businesses to come in and do big jobs. And then all of a sudden, you had to be Red Seal. You had to have a Red Seal certification. In order to get Red Seal certification, you have to have an education. In order to get an education, you have to complete high school. In order to complete high school, you have to have a good foundation within your elementary school. And so we're seeing exactly what Corvell is talking about, that our school system and the structures that exist aren't necessarily allowing us to continue to own our own businesses. And so you're being put out of businesses because there's other big businesses that come with the qualifications, that come with the Red Seals, the carpenters, and then our folks are the ones who are working and carrying the belts because of how the economy has changed. And now it's very difficult to have black-owned businesses because of being pushed out by the bigger businesses. We've talked many times about the need to have Afrocentric schools. And how do we get that going? How do we get that structured? And I can tell you, people are getting ripe to say we really need to be accountable when we're seeing how much the system is damaging our children at all levels. And we are beginning to get angry enough to say enough, right? And when you think about my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, most of them didn't have a high school education. But they owned their own homes. They worked. They weren't dependent on social assistance. They raised more than 2 children in their families somehow. Everybody was fed and clothed. So what was different then compared to now around the economy and around our wants and our desires and how we have become consumers, right? And there is this fear, when we talk about activism, of losing our jobs, of people losing their jobs. So the idea of people hiding behind the camera where they really wanted to be engaged is very challenging, because there was organizations that had money that if you lost your job for a couple of weeks, or if you didn't have money, they would support you. Your mortgage would be supported. We don't have that same type of support in our community organizations. Say, you know what, you go do this. I remember the sit-in that Lynn helped to stage at the community YMCA when the employment center was there, and it lasted, the longest sit-in, 120 days.
April to August?
And people were willing to lose their jobs. There was a great rotation, that there was, people would come out if you had to go work, someone else would come in to sit while you went out. And there was just this great system of activism that happened.
It's right. It's like you're not really at a sit-in, and of course there was no FaceTime to let him know that that's where you really were. But here I am, dear. I'm really here.
Right. So I do miss some of that active and political movement that I was a part of. And so that's the way I look at the Black economy. It's going to be great. It's going to be very challenging to get it back to where it was, because of some of the different structures that are presently existing.
Okay. We've got a hand here in the back.
I had a few comments about all that was said. I agree with the entrepreneurial spirit. That's true.
And your name is?
Rashida Simons.
Thank you. I knew that.
But also along with that, there was an interconnectedness and a trust in the communities.
Yes.
So like you said about people being afraid to lose their job, well, they knew so-and-so was a farmer so they could get food, and so-and-so could watch children. And what the desegregation did was destabilize the community. So a lot of people, including myself, believe it's a double-edged sword. So you're getting these opportunities over here, but we're taking away these kind of strongholds that you've built up. So in terms of entrepreneurship, we began to go outside of our communities, maybe to almost indulge in a way in services and goods and places that we couldn't go. And so a belief I know of, maybe, I'm not of that generation, but I feel that perhaps a belief was, we fought for this. So we're gonna go to these restaurants and these stores and so on and so forth to, reap the benefits of what we fought long and hard for. So it's not only entrepreneurship, also in terms of education. When we talk about the Afrocentric school, we had Afrocentric schools before schools were desegregated. And our schools in our Black community had Black principals, Black teachers, all Black children. And then when that was desegregated, they bused Black children out of Black communities to white schools and white communities, so-called. Within that, something that's often forgotten is the Black teacher, because then they didn't have jobs anymore, right? And I say this all the time because it's something that we don't really talk about. But my mom always reminds me, because she's an educator as well. So the teachers who taught her when she was going to school in Partridge River, in East Preston, in an all-Black segregated school, when things were desegregated, where did they go, right? What did they do? So that's one thing. It destabilized kind of the trust and the security that we had in one another, because we had to. So we knew we couldn't go outside and get that support. Our support was home in the community. So that's what it did. So it all ties in together, all those things. Another thing, when Mr. Ruck was talking, I was thinking, he had made the comment, how do we define ourselves? Who are we considering Black, or who are we considering this group? And I think that there's been a shying away of Black Nova Scotians who are descendants of Black loyalists, Black refugees, however you want to classify that, there's been a shying away of making ourselves a group to ourselves. And I want to say that there's nothing wrong with that. It's not to say that because we're defining ourselves as a group that we're not willing to work with other groups of Black people. But there comes a point where you do kind of have to establish yourself as, I guess, a culture. Because then we can really address what needs are ours. Because we can't say that our needs are the same as, say, someone who's coming from continental Africa, someone who's maybe from the Caribbean. There's lots of different needs that our children in our communities have. So sometimes when you lump it all in together, you don't address those very specific things. And it's not to say that we can't have partnerships with other people that look like us and that share some experiences, but don't have maybe some of the specific needs. I was thinking about that driving over here. We should do that as a group. Our historical Black communities maybe get representatives to speak on our behalf. Because sometimes what happens is we have meetings like this and everyone's talking, but there's no like group to go to that we trust, that we can say, okay, something's going on with us, let's get them. And it's their job to do these things. So I think that's something that we need also to be taken seriously, I believe, on the political stage, because there's no set group, there's no set leadership. It's just people stand up and then sometimes they don't, and then sometimes they do, and sometimes it's the same people. So that's something that I think we should address too. And I think that's all the points I had. Yeah.
Before we pass on to Raymond, we just want to check on one of our elders.
Yes, we would be absolutely remiss if we did not at least offer an opportunity to the floor and offer the mic to Sister Dr. Lynn Jones, who has a very long and varied history of activism, including keeping people hostage in an employment center for several months. So anything that you care to offer from a place of wisdom, Lynn, and experience? So go ahead. You're passing the mic this time, Ryan? You drop, or they say, drop the mic. Don't drop it for sure.
David Sparks here.
Oh, I didn't see you there. Sorry, David.
I want to speak to what I feel is the heart of the matter.
Okay.
I've been listening, observing, listening to the comments, and I think it's important that we keep this dialogue in historical perspective, that we look at where we are on the historic continuum. And I just want to maybe historically look at how we got to where we are. At the end of the 60s, for example, you had the birth of Black power, Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism. And as someone said, whenever something happens in the US, it spills over into Canada. And so in Nova Scotia, Black power, Black nationalism, Pan-Africanism took root. And many of our intellectuals, if you will, bought into the Black power movement. And so we are now faced with a real dilemma. We have conflicting ideologies, conflicting philosophies, and we can't seem to agree on the means and the ends. And that is to say, the ends that we are seeking and the means that we will use to achieve the ends that we are seeking. And so there's this ongoing conflict between the Afrocentric model and the Christian model. I'm rooted in the indigenous Black community. I'm pro-Black, but I'm not anti-white. And I have to affirm the dignity and the worth of the white person as well as the Black person. I'm Christian. And I would like to think that most of the indigenous Blacks in Nova Scotia are Christian. And so we have a real problem. in terms of our philosophy, in terms of our ideology. And so how do we resolve this dilemma? I see it as the elephant in the room. It's one of the most pressing problems, and yet it's the one least talked about.
That is?
This
The
conflicting ideology.
Between Christianity and?
Afrocentricity.
Okay, so there's a clarification that we need there. I don't think Christianity has a monopoly on affirming the humanity of others. In fact, that is first and foremost in the doctrine and the belief in the philosophy of Afrocentricity. There are many people, I think...
Well, can I finish?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I wasn't... Yeah, well, yeah, go ahead, say some more.
Well, I think that's where we are, historically speaking. I think the church has done a terrible job in addressing this issue. I think our clergy need to come out from behind the stained glass window, and it needs to address the issues that are affecting our people, rather than leaving it up to people who may not subscribe to our philosophy of the Christian faith. And so we need to talk about this issue, because what you have people who are in the church who are living what Du Bois called a double consciousness. They are in both worlds. They are in the Afrocentric world and they are in the Christian world. And oftentimes the church is used as a kind of platform. And so we need to seriously consider this issue, and I think we need to have a dialogue, and I think we need to respect one's opinions and not between differing ideologies.
What is the actual conflict? I understand that it's two different ideologies.
Yeah, two different worlds.
What's happening in the Afrocentric ideology, and what's happening in the Christian ideology that is not congruent? I don't understand. That's all I want to know is where's the problem?
Well, the problem lies in the fact that the Christian faith affirms the dignity of every individual, that it's universal, that it's all-inclusive. Well, not necessarily. No, it's been Eurocentric. That's the problem. We have a very Eurocentric theology. Okay, it's very Eurocentric. But there is an Afrocentric theology as well, okay, which I'm trying to promote and develop. Okay, Afrocentricity is more inclusive, or rather exclusive, I should say. Okay, and it's not all-encompassing. Okay, it's worldview. It's not a Christian view.
I have to interject right here.
Yes, please let me.
I have to interject right here because
let me address this,
believe
please,
that
sister.
your characterization. I just think that it's incumbent upon me to speak to this issue because this event is under the banner of the Afrocentric Learning Institute.
Yeah. Sister, can
and that the characterization.
Yes.
The characterization that you are presenting of Afrocentricity is inaccurate.
Okay, enlighten me.
And it is wholly inaccurate.
Enlighten me.
And that I think where you're finding the dichotomy, or they're not polar opposites, first and foremost. And where you are talking about the conflict, I think may generate from the fact that Afrocentricity as a philosophy does do a running critique on Christianity and the hypocrisy of Christianity to claim that it affirms the humanity of all people, and under the name of Christianity, some of the most atrocious actions, and they continue to happen under the banner of Christianity. And I think that Afrocentricity critiques that, and critiques the Eurocentric agenda of Christianity, and which is why most Afrocentrists do reject Christianity in its organized state and form. There are individuals I know who call themselves Afrocentrists, but who still worship in Christian churches and so forth, you know? And many of those people are in this room tonight. Mm-hmm. And because in life, we all live lots of contradictions. You know, we are never all of one thing or the other, that we sit and occupy spaces and places where we know we don't I go to church, I go to a Christian church, and I sit there and I commune, and it's a wonderful thing, and I just say, don't file that part. Yeah, that part was good. And, so we know that we don't take everything wholesale, but at the same time, I must have to rebut you when you make the claim, and this would be a wonderful topic for another time, that Afrocentricity and Christianity are polar opposites, and to suggest that Christianity has a higher moral
mandate?
Moral monopoly on affirming the humanity of people, because I do not believe that to be correct. And not that all Afrocentrists can claim that either, because I don't think there are any holisms in any kinds of philosophies that we aspire to. So I just wanted to put that out there. And we've got two people over here that want to speak before we...
But I also wanted to note that we have about 10 minutes. And so we want to try and wrap up some of our conversations. And so we had Ifu and Tina who want to contribute. And I also want to make the point in terms of when you talked about Afrocentricity being not inclusive, that's not accurate as well. We can have more dialogue about that when we're breaking bread together, if you're still with us.
But we thank you for your comments, because this is what we wanted to happen tonight, this kind of conversation. Yeah. Thank you, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. I was born in the motherland. I'm African. And we're also sitting in Mi'kmaq territory. The first slave ship was called Jesus. So to tell me that a ship called Jesus is something that represents the affirming of the humanity of all people is historically inaccurate. And this is African Heritage Month. So the idea of the universality of the Eurocentric ideology of Christianity is also historically inaccurate, and it's also a practice of white supremacy. So I rebuke that in the name of our ancestors, because we were full-formed human beings with spiritual practices, and they came in and they raped us, both mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. So I rebuke that in the name of our ancestors, because that is very fundamentally disrespectful to our ancestors, and it's fundamentally disrespectful for me as an African who refuses to accept the Eurocentric misunderstanding of Christianity. Now I say misunderstanding, because they actually stole Christianity from us. We were the ones who exported Christianity to Europe, and then they came back with what I would call a polluted, perverted version of it. Right? It's like if I teach you a dance, and then you decide, you know what, we don't want black people, so we're going to make it Elvis, and then say that they invented that nonsense. So we need to be clear that this is the theft of our intellectual property as Africans, and we should reject the Eurocentric version of it, and then go back to the Afrocentric version of it. The oldest church on the planet is in Ethiopia. It's not in Europe. And the reason why you see white people wearing the robes that they wear, those are Ethiopian high priest robes. They're not European. Africans have always been inclusive. We don't see that history in Europe. So don't get things twisted and say that Afrocentric is not inclusive. Afrocentric is probably one of the most inclusive. Afrocentric is an indigenous African philosophy. We have principles of Ubuntu, we have principles of Sankofa. Those are inclusive. Can you name me one Eurocentric thing that is actually inclusive?
Walmart?
Okay. Walmart is responsible for slavery.
Shops there.
Right? Say Walmart. So I think if we want to be serious, I think back home we say iron sharpens iron. I believe that as humans we have an amazing capacity to be wrong, and we need to humbly learn from each other. Absolutely. And as iron sharpens iron, we will get better. They say when you know better, you do better. If you were drinking water and you didn't realize the water was poisoned, and your brother, your sister tells you it's poisoned, then we have a responsibility to stop drinking it. Exactly. So if you're drinking that Kool-Aid, otherwise known as white Christianity with the white Jesus, who wasn't even white, then you need to stop drinking that Kool-Aid and then remember who your ancestors are and keep it real. Why are we all here? We're here because we're Africans. If you look at your history, everybody descended from Africans. Even those Ku Klux Klan carrying people also descended from Africans. They don't actually recognize that history, but that's because they're lost. And so we just need to bring back the love. We need to bring back the truth. And we need to start telling the truth to each other. Some truths are uncomfortable, and that's okay. But we need to tell the truth. And so I'm proud to be African. I'm proud to be African Nova Scotian, but I also understand that there are specific issues and things that affect the indigenous African Nova Scotian community that doesn't directly affect me. So my duty as an African is to be in solidarity and to support the things that don't directly affect me, but directly affect you, because we're family. And in the same vein, we support each other. But we're gonna go back to love. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know that Tina and then Raymond, and then we have to wrap it up, and Harvey's making a signal to me. Okay, that's it? Okay, so we're gonna, the same way we started, we're gonna end with our folks who started our conversation, and then we'll have more as we break food together. So Tina and then Raymond.
Okay, I'll try and be quick. There are two things that I was thinking about. This has been a very powerful conversation. One of the things that I thought a couple of comments ago was related to the reorganization of our communities in many ways, and maybe that's also related to the conversations about religion and the place of religion and things like that. When in a different time, there were different ways that we organized ourselves and who we depended on and how that support network was structured. And I think that that's related to two different things. For me, one is leadership. We've talked a lot, or at moments, about leadership, and to try and identify who we decide to follow is a very interesting process to me. I think about the impact of lots of different issues, whether it be gender or class or all sorts of things that impact who it is we are willing to stand behind. So when we lose someone like Rocky, who people could agree to stand behind, how do we figure out how to find someone else to stand behind? And obviously that's a whole part of succession planning and all sorts of things that we do as a community to build up each other and to support each other. But it just makes me think about how we go about trying to set up those people in positions that, I guess it's related to the idea of interconnectedness and all of the relationship building work that we have to do with each other so that we have trust in whichever individuals are identified as community leaders. Because I think there's a lot of resistance to previous paradigms that didn't involve accountability. And to me, accountability, and I don't mean some like respectability, politics, you have to do this certain thing type of accountability. I mean in terms of who we are, in terms of how we relate to each other, in terms of our most intimate connections to each other, to our family members, to our partners, to our children, and then growing from there to our neighbors, to the wider community. And then the last thing is just to talk about how we identify the infrastructure that we need. Like what is it that we actually need? Because we're in a different time. There's a lot to learn from history and a lot to be gained from reflecting on that. But we live right now, and we have challenges from right now, and we maybe need a different infrastructure than we needed many years ago. And I guess the last thing that I'll say is on that question of who the Black community is here. I'm an immigrant, but I definitely respect the need for people from here. I'm African American, and so in the United States, there would be immigrants from all different places who came, and they would say, oh, what's happening with the Black people here? Why aren't the Black people here doing X, Y, or Z? And I remember the type of alienation that I felt when people didn't respect the history and the culture of the people there, or of us in the United States. So I definitely respect and always try and do my best to acknowledge that to whatever extent I try and be an activist, it is trying to take on my little bitty part in the much larger and much bigger history that exists of people here who, well before I moved here in 2010, have been advocating for this community and do things that benefit my own children who were born here and who are raised here.
Raymond, if it can be succinct, because our time is running up, running out. So.
It is now. Anyway, Just to tie in a couple of things, and there's so much to speak about, and I think sometimes we complicate things. I mean, there's some things that need not be complicated. For instance, I'm a proud indigenous African Nova Scotian that respects people of African descent, whether it's from Timbuktu to Sydney River. It doesn't matter if you come from the islands, whatever. NH from Congo, shot in the back. I want to help him. He's a brother. And, you know, blackness, Afrocentrism, so on and so on, state of mind. You know, people say, if you look black, you're black. No, not necessarily, because people have been jumping the broom on the other side of the fence, so, you know, whatever. And this whole thing about religion, it's like, I'm an African Nova Scotian. I'm an indigenous African Nova Scotian. I don't go to church. I don't prescribe to this white Jesus and all that stuff. I don't. I believe in a creator, and that's the end of the story, and so on. I know where that religion comes from, in the sense of people that don't look like me, as Ifu said, and so on. And we have yet to address, you know, privilege. People of European descent are always looking for passes from us. Like, we have this, oh, you okay? Yeah, you did that, okay, you pass, and so on and so on. We gotta stop letting those folks think that we can give them passes when their ancestors owned, manipulated, killed, chopped, whatever you want, our people, and so on. No, you can be a dignified, respectful ally, but you have to do something to earn that title. So I'm giving no passes. Thank you.
So we want to say thank you on behalf of ALI.
No, I'm not. I have a question.
Oh, yes. We do have some other folks at the talk. So that's what I was saying. So we want to end this part of our conversation.
It's part of the conversation.
Okay, so we're going to turn it over to her.
All right.
Right, so I'm taking some privilege here, you know.
You go right ahead.
Go to her.
Folks, my name is Harvey Miller. First of all, I acknowledge that I'm on unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, and I stand on the shoulders of all ancestors around the world. Just to bring things back to our original title, which is Dead or Alive, the State of African Nova Scotian Activism. I'm wondering, the reason why I guess that we have to continue to advocate, or we need to really challenge systems and so on, because we have not fully gotten to where we want to get to yet, right? However we define that. And if I may put on a bit of my consulting hat sometimes, then I would say then, what capacity do we need to be able to fulfill that? So if you look at the community and we were to do some kind of asset mapping of our capabilities, where are the weaknesses? And how do we go to battle school? How do we create battle school? Because essentially it's a struggle, it's a fight, it's a war. And if it's a war, then you have to go to battle school. You have to train. So where does the training actually happen? Where does it happen? And in what areas do we need to build capacity? If you think, I know nobody wants to talk about war, but if you think about it as a metaphor, you know, you have the folks who have to fly the helicopters, folks who have to actually, the battleships, you know, the folks who are the infantry. So we need all those things, and not just, and so while we have had the sort of, the matches and so on, that's one form of a strategy. What other strategies do we need? And then do we have the capacity? And if we don't, where do we build that capacity, and how do we build that capacity and create coalitions? So that when we put it all together, we could actually advance our agenda a lot faster. So what's the state? Where are the weaknesses? Yes. How do we actually create the capacity that we need so that we can move a lot faster?
Yeah. Thank you. Right. And I think
So
we also have to go to our chairperson. Karen, I don't know if you had anything to say this evening to welcome, so I don't know if you want to do the closing off of this evening as our ALI chair, and then we'll break for food. Well, it's 1:45.
There's a mic.
So you want to take the mic?
Take this one.
Evening. I just want to say thank you to everyone who participated in the conversation starters and actually gave input in terms of the state of our activism within the Black Nova Scotian communities, dead or alive. So I think you've already decided for yourself that we're still alive because we're still moving, we're still dealing with issues, we're still in the struggle, we're still addressing current things that are happening every day. Some of you have been already aware of things that have happened at the Parliament, and so we have our young people who are addressing that. And hopefully, as in the struggle, that we continue to support whoever is struggling against the oppressor, be it within education, be within the justice systems, be within the politicians, whoever it may be. I think every one of you have a voice here to give, and I think that's important. Our voices are important, and that's what we're trying to do, is make sure that we provide some thought and provoke some interest. And that's what the Afrocentric Learning Institute is about, is providing thought-provoking information to take a stand, strategize, to organize, and provide a space so that we can come together and decide what we're going to do together. Are we going to move forward, or are we just going to stand still and let the state decide for us? So it basically is up to us what we decide to do next. I just want to say thank you to North Branch Library. Thank you to Dr. Harvey Miller, to our facilitators here, everyone who came out this evening for your contribution. It's all important. And of course, to the Sister Nancy back there for providing the refreshments. I'm just wishing everybody get home safe and sound, and that's it for the evening.
And that you sign up, because we want to have more.
Oh yeah, please sign up, please sign up.
We want to be able to send you an email when the video is edited and put out on YouTube, and we want to be able to push that information to you. So if you give us your email address when that gets launched, we will send it to you so you can send it to other people. So, and we have some nice refreshments to take with you or to have here.
One more minute, we're just about done.
Yeah, I just want to say that please subscribe to our channel. It's basically you just go to youtube.com, Africentric TV. And so a lot of our videos are posted there. And share that with your networks. And we will edit this video and put it on so that you could, share it with other folks around the country, around the world, around the province. All right?
So we'll put the...
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harvey. And we will... Oh, just 1 second before you do that. The sign up so that you can get the push of the video notice will be right over here. I'll be right over here by the food table. You can't miss the food, so you'll be able to give us your email address so we can find out when this is going to happen. Okay. Great.
All right. Prime Minister Trudeau is going to be at...
Hold on, somebody's speaking.
Prime Minister Trudeau, otherwise known as Crime Minister, is going to be at the Black Cultural Center tomorrow, apparently to address the insult to the Africans who were in Parliament. But this was not an... Check. All right. So tomorrow at 2 o'clock, there will be a demonstration, a gathering of black.
Yeah.
People who love black people, if you can make it out tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Sorry, 1:30, because we need to 1:30, Black Cultural Center, Cherry Brook. Be there. I have space in my car. Other people have space in their car. Let's get out there.
Not going.
Talk to each other. Don't you want to go?
Cold. Nice. I found it cold.
It's right, because it's supposed to snow, isn't it? Wow. Thank you for coming. Have a bite. I know. I'm going to be in Ottawa. I'm not going. Yeah. I'm going to be in Ottawa.
didn't go up. Sit back there.
We're gonna miss the food.
I had this idea, right? I didn't want to jump in, especially